We are live. Yes, here we are, LeaderSHIP 2.0. So happy to be here with my good friends, Jon Weirauch and Angelina Frost. Kristina Holle, who's part of the team, was unable to join us today. So we're going to have a three-way round robin about, I think, a topic that can be transformative on every level, from personal to interpersonal to organizational. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But before we do, I'd just like each of my guests, my co-hosts, to introduce themselves and specifically tell us what part of the world you're tuning in from, and then a little bit about why you are part of this leadership team. I'm going to start with Angelina Frost, please.
Hi, everybody. I am Angelina Frost, and I am coming to you live from Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So
and,
good.
So leadership has been, I think it's just a kind of part of like how I'm shaped as a being, as a soul. But I was reluctant about being in, although I naturally always moved toward being in the leadership roles, I also felt very kind of ambivalent about, the models that we have kind of predispose us to thinking that if you are being a leader that you've got to boss people around and stuff like that. And that didn't really resonate with me. So the model that I inherited kind of turned the concept of leadership in general, turned me off to it. And then in the late 2000s, I was very actively involved with the preservation of the headwaters forest up in Northern California. And Julia Butterfly Hill was somebody that I had been paying attention to as a thought leader already by that time for a number of years. And so she came to our town to celebrate her birthday at a monthly music event that happens there. And she made an announcement about a course that she had put together called What's Your Tree? Because people were coming to her when she would do her talks at churches and, all the places where she would, speak live and saying, Julia, you had this thing with the tree and I just, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. And out of these many conversations, her question came, well, what is your tree? And when she realized that people were really having a difficult time of anchoring into purpose, this is what inspired her to pull this, to get together with other smart people that she was collaborating and working with. And they created a 12-piece series. And upon this announcement, I was just like, I'm all over that. Like, I need to know what purpose is for myself, right?
Yeah, right.
And as soon as I graduated from the course, I immediately signed up to start being one of the facilitators in the Bay Area. And then I wound up being the director for the whole San Francisco Bay Area for all of the other groups that were there for a couple of years. And it was a really very enriching experience. And the idea of leading with versus power over models is the thing that really pulls me into this conversation, because I feel like it's a really important conversation for us to be catalyzing into our collective now. It just feels like it's time.
Beautiful. That's awesome. What a great story. And yeah, it's amazing how our perception shapes our reality, right? Your perception of what leadership meant actually kept you out of the discussion. And then something happens to catalyze a completely different perception of the exact same concept. And now you're all in. And I got to tell you, that happens to me all the time, right? I think I know something about something, and I got this predisposed desire to be involved or to not be involved. And then something flips and I realize that isn't really what it's about. At least now it's about something else, because the meaning has changed, or I've changed, or all of that, right? And so I talk a lot about content and context, and I won't get into that right now. But when the context changes, sometimes the content takes a new meaning, just like leadership. And my hope and my intention with your group, this group, and also with those who tune in, is that we will provide some sort of catalyst, a spark, to help change your perception just a little bit about what leadership can be. Because I think a lot of people do have, well, everybody has a preconceived notion about what does that mean? What does leadership mean? And often it's based in your experience, it's based in your education, it's based in your perception, but it can always be expanded, and it's our hope to expand it. So I'm going to pass this off to Jon Weirauch. Jon, introduce yourself and let us know where you're broadcasting from, and then lead us into the first part of this discussion about these 5 core principles.
Yeah, let's dig in. I'm here in Frankenmuth, Michigan, have a population of like 5,000, but believe it or not, we are Michigan's #1 tourist destination. Got some really interesting, unique things here. We're called Michigan's Little Bavaria.
Yeah.
But I'm in my
The moose.
the
The
moose.
moose.
You know it.
I
I'm in
do.
my incomplete basement studio here, and you can tell that by the shadows my plants are casting. But it's a work in progress, like we
Love
all
it.
are.
Yes.
You know,
100%.
I think my journey that brought me into why I do consulting in this area of leadership and culture, that could be a 2-hour podcast in itself, I think,
Right?
and a book, and it might be a book someday. But I think just to summarize my current passion and why I do this and why I work as hard as I can to get this message out, it's twofold. Number one, we're all leaders, whether we have a titled position or not.
Right.
And I think it is extremely important for us to become better leaders of ourselves, both in our awareness of ourselves and the management of ourselves, so that that's kind of step one. And then so that we can have excellent and fulfilling relationships with others. So
Yeah.
that's like step one right there on my passion. And then the step two is bring that into the organizational setting, still whether you have a title or not. But those of us that do have titles in that realm, man, what an impact we can have on people's lives when we're working 40 to 50 hours a week for 40 to 50 years of our lives. My saying I've been presenting lately is as a supervisor, as a manager of people, you can literally make people's lives a living hell or a living heaven and everywhere in between.
Right.
So what are you going to do with that responsibility and that power? Are we going to use our powers for good?
So let me jump in there. Let me put a pause on that for a second, John,
Yeah.
before you start into today's topic. So I just want to give a little bit of my own journey too. As I expressed a couple episodes ago, I had probably the best leader, the best model of leadership that I've ever had in my entire life, or that I've even known. Was my first job out of college. I was an intern, and the president of the university, who had befriended me while I was a student, he takes me under his wing and literally led with his heart. Me specifically, treated me like his own son, maybe even better, because I never got reprimanded for anything, right? But he was coaching me, mentoring me, teaching me, giving me responsibilities. He had me write letters for him on my first week, and you've heard this story before, but it was incredible to me. And so this was long before I even started studying leadership, and I didn't know how awesome I was. I didn't know what I was getting. I didn't know what a blessing this was. I just knew I loved this guy, and I would do anything for him, right? And my internship was pretty nebulous, so I really did do anything for him, but I did it with great joy because I felt so honored and empowered. But as I told you guys a couple episodes ago, unfortunately, that set me up for a lifetime of disappointment because he's the only boss that really did that incredibly well. Other bosses had, some of that, but he just embodied it. It was his DNA, it was his soul, right? And so now when I get further into my career and I've left that job behind and I start having this friction, well, what happened to the Waynes of the world, right? How come my new boss what's going wrong here? That really got me hooked. Like, well, something that Wayne has, I want to have for my own self when I become a leader. And also I hope that somehow I could influence the leadership around me. So that kind of is my journey into leadership. It's the short version. Like you said, John, I could talk about that for hours. But so now let's give people a why first, right? Why should anybody even listen to this particular broadcast? Why should they listen to us? Most of the people that are tuned in are either our friends or we're complete strangers. But I want to give everybody a compelling why, and they don't really know what they're in for yet, right? You guys do, because we've set up the framework. But before we get into the specifics, I'd like Angelina and then John to give a why. Why is it important for anybody to even pay attention to what we're saying today? Angelina, if you'd start.
Why is it important? There are so many reasons. I mean, if we're talking about leadership in business, for example, the bottom line, right?
Yep.
If you have a
Number one.
happy workforce, a thriving workforce, a workforce that feels welcome and invited to bring their innovation, to bring their genius, their creativity to the table, right?
Yes.
Then you have a thriving workforce, a happy workforce, a workforce that stays, and all of these things manifest in the bottom line.
Good. Excellent.
Right?
Yeah, that's one of many reasons, as you said. But I'm glad you picked that one out to start with. John and I have talked about this at length. So, John, I'm going to give you two things. One, give your compelling why, should anybody even care what we're saying. And then two, lead us into the first tenet, our first principle we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, sounds good. And I love that we started off with the bottom line, because a lot of times when we dig into this type of stuff, I hear, is this some sort of kumbaya movement or kumbaya moment?
Yep.
And sure, maybe it
Happy
is.
joy,
That's
joy.
right, Angelina. That's right.
Right.
But the thing is, it leads to bottom line improvements. It leads to profits to have that culture, to have an effective leadership team and team of supervisors and managers leading your organization. So I think what I'm going to say as far as today's episode and why today
Yeah.
it's important to dig in and listen in, it is an amazing self journey. And actually, I am going to just jump right into these
Please
books.
do. Yeah,
So the
jump right
Four
in.
Agreements, by Don Miguel Ruiz, and then the Fifth Agreement. I'm a big reader. I've always been. More recently, the last several years of my life, more on the, I would call like self-help or maybe self-development, leadership development type books. Really big into emotional intelligence, things like that. A friend of mine referred this book to me. He said, "John, I think you might like this book, The Four Agreements." And I'm just like, yeah, he's a trusted friend. He's a great friend. We're very like-minded. I was like, okay, let's hop into this. And this, I will say, is a standalone book that I was able to read. It made me think. It made me want to implement. We get in these ruts sometimes where we read, and we gain knowledge. We know these things we're supposed to do, but then we have to actually take time to do it.
Yes. Hey.
And I honestly believe these books are the ones that I have been able to focus on and implement almost more than any other book I've read. What's interesting about them is that I would call this almost completely like self-improvement. Now, as you improve yourself, you become a better leader. And so this is certainly leadership development, and these are certainly leadership tactics. But at least at my stage in my life, when I read this book, I'm not kidding you, it made me a better person. It made me think about things. Now, when we talk about the Four Agreements, let's just hop into it. Number 1, be impeccable with your word. Number 2, don't take anything personally. Number 3, don't make assumptions. Number 4, always do your best. It's like, okay, heard all those things my entire life. Why do I need to read this huge book?
I think my mom wrote this book, right?
That's right. But he unpacks it in a way that just really makes you look at the world in a little bit of a different way. Now, I've referred this book to some people, and if you are like, this book is almost spiritual in nature. It taps into like these ancient religions, and so if I've referred it to like a hardcore Christian before, which I would consider myself one of those, but it was a turnoff for them because it didn't really position it in the names of God and Jesus. I've handed it to people that aren't so spiritual, although we're all spiritual. They didn't consider themselves very spiritual and a little turned off by the spirituality behind it all and just the abstract nature on how he approaches these topics. I dug in. It really grasped me. I listened to it on audiobook. I've read it. I think I've gone through both of these books at least 2 or 3 times. So that's the why. It'll help you become a better person, and it's a weight that's lifted off of you if you do this. Especially the don't take anything personally. All of them, actually, all 4 of these things, I would consider this is a weightlifting book. The 5th one is great. The Fifth Agreement is that second book, which recaps the first book in a very excellent way, and then presents this new agreement too. So if you can only read one, I'd say go ahead and read the second one because it recaps everything quite well. So anyways, long introduction to number 1, be impeccable with your word.
So hold on. Put in that for a second. So just so that people catch this, and because I can't do comments where I am right now, and maybe you guys want to type this in as well. The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz came out in 1997. And then he wrote the sequel, The Fifth Agreement, which came out in 2010. You can find that at Amazon or anywhere else. And as Angelina and I and John will say, it's well worth your time. However, as Robin Sharma teaches, ideation without implementation is delusion. John already alluded to this. Ideation without implementation is delusion. So I just encourage myself, as I'm listening to you and Angelina and myself talk about this today, remember that it's a great idea, but it's only a great idea it's not going to make an impact in my life and my organization unless I implement it. And that takes baby steps. Okay, Jon, so jump into number 1 and read it slow. And if there's a summary, if you give us a quick summary before you give us your take on it.
Yeah, number 1, be impeccable with your word. Speak with integrity. Say only what you mean. Avoid using the word to speak against yourself or to gossip about others. Use the power of your word in the direction of truth and love. Okay, so do you have 3 hours to talk about this before we get to the other ones?
Mic drop, baby, mic drop.
Yeah. And I will tell you I'll start with something quick and let you guys take up on it. But what was interesting for me is I've always considered myself a fairly truthful person. I don't like to tell lies. When I was younger and just let kind of things fly out of my mouth, I'd regret them. If I tried to fib, to my parents, it would eat away at me. I tried to fib to a friend or significant other, and it would eat away at me. And so I was just like, I can't do this anymore. There's no lying. And not that I was like a really bad liar, but I think if we're all honest with ourselves, little white lies slip out here and there, right?
Of course.
To be impeccable with our word is to every little word. Don't just, if you're in the heat of a moment of a conversation, like, oh yeah, I agree, if you really don't agree. And in the realm of gossiping, it's like, I cannot believe how much we gossip as humans, both at the workplace and in our personal lives. And some people don't even realize they're gossiping. They're just having conversation. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, right.
And when I seize up anymore. I just kind of like smile. And if someone's saying something that I don't think should be said, I'll step in and say, I don't really feel comfortable talking about someone like that. I have a rule. I will only talk. If I'm going to talk about you, I will say the same thing I would say if you were standing right next to me. Okay. That is my personal rule. So those 2 things, just getting those little white lies out of your life, just kind of affirming things that you might, just agreeing to be agreeable. It doesn't make you feel good. It doesn't let people know the truth of who you really are. And then I'll stop there and let you guys pick up. I could talk forever.
I'm going to pass this on to Angelina, but first I just want to point out, a couple things. First of all, a VeggieTales episode came to mind. There's one about the big fib, and it's absolutely hilarious. If you're a parent, you've probably seen this. If you are a parent and you haven't, look up VeggieTales and the big fib, and it puts it in an absolutely hilarious light. But it's got a lot of truth in there. But this idea about gossip and I can't remember the exact words, but I heard something just recently that small-minded people talk about people, and medium-minded people talk about events, and large-minded people or expanding wise people talk about ideas, right? And we are not any one of those things. We are all of those things, and it's all the time, of course. So what that reminds me is if I pay attention and I'm aware of, am I spending my time talking about people, or am I talking about events, or am I talking about ideas? And if I can continually push myself towards the ideas, then I'm actually a wiser person. And maybe I'm not wiser, but maybe I sound wiser, which is well worth it, right? So let me pass that on to Angelina. You can take that anywhere you want about impeccable words.
Yeah, the thing that because I grew up in a place where being super honest to the point where and maybe a little like Tourette's-y or something, I don't know. But I got in trouble for being, truth everywhere. Right. And so it wasn't appreciated. And so I learned how to lie because I recognized that truth wasn't actually welcome, that my honesty, my truth, my angle wasn't welcome. Right. Yes. And that it ate away at me.
Sure.
Right.
Of course.
It also put me into a position when I was like in my early adulthood where I felt like I was living a double life. And it made life stressful in a way that was, you have to keep track of that stuff.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so by the time I actually read the 4 agreements, I had already made the agreement with myself that was over. I didn't live in a world anymore where that was necessary. I recognized it as a coping mechanism, and little bit by little bit, I just started kind of experimenting. Well, like, if I'm honest in this situation, are they still going to love me? Are they still going to welcome me? And bit by bit, I realized that I had like found my way into a safe world and everything was fine, right? The thing for anybody that can relate to this story is that it simplifies your life in a way you cannot really comprehend until after you cross that bridge. And crossing that bridge is not necessarily easy. This way of being unimpeccable with our word is kind of woven into the culture. There is a lot of it. There's a lot of people pleasing. There is a lot of like, representing, even just like putting up an image of ourselves is in a way kind of being not impeccable if we're not, right? It's like projecting something that isn't really true or reflective of how we are feeling or what we think or all that stuff. So it simplifies life. This is a beautiful, beautiful benefit from, and then the other piece that came up that as I was listening and being reminded of these is I see them like I see in the anonymous programs, which I was raised by people who were in these programs, all of them, right? Yeah. They have these steps and they have these traditions. And what I've come to understand as I've looked at these for my own just like enrichment and understanding is that these are principles by which to live a life that sucks less.
Right. Well put. Well put.
You know?
Yeah, well put. A life that sucks less. I can sign up for that, right? So like Jon and Angelina, but a different take on this same idea is that honesty was always the best policy when I grew up. And in fact, if you were caught lying, you paid the price. There was a hefty price. And so it was definitely the number one rule. It was highly valued in my life. But because of the punishment that was attached to it and my fear of being punished, right, then I would find ways to shade the truth to my favor. I wasn't lying, but I also wasn't telling the truth. I was telling what would get me out of trouble. And that was fairly adaptive when I was a kid, because especially when I was living with my stepdad who would fly off the handle for anything, I kept myself out of harm's way. Okay, that's adaptive, great. The problem is it worked so well that I ingrained in me this habit, right, of not just saying what I think or feel, but saying what I think you want me to hear, right? And that gets me into trouble, has got me into trouble my entire life. And I won't tell you all those stories, but I got to tell you, my life in those instances really did suck when I'm just playing shapeshifter here to make sure that I don't get in trouble and I'm saying all the right things. Well, eventually, of course, that comes back to bite me because I can't even remember what I said to whom. And then the questions are like, well, I thought you said this and you said that to her. And I'm like backpedaling, trying to find, a way to make it all work. But that is a sucky way to live, right? And so the opposite side of the suckiness is freedom, I believe. And I think this is one of the summary statements in Don Miguel Ruiz's book, that if we can adopt these principles and implement them, it's actually principles, not just commandments, but it's a freedom. It's a way to live freely because you're not caught up in the baggage and all of the repercussions. I call them the natural consequences of not living this way. Right? And some people, some religious people, and many that I know, and I even kind of adopted this for a while, was, if you do the wrong thing, then God's going to get you, which was a terrible way to view God, who is love, right? That was a terrible paradigm. But what I've come to realize is that mostly when I choose to not live by these agreements, I suffer the natural consequences, right? There's laws in place in the universe that cause friction when you're not living in harmony with yourself, with others, and with God. So these things are a way to live in harmony with yourself, others, and God. And as a result, your life sucks a lot less. Okay, Jon, let's segue to number 2, if you would.
No, can't.
Okay, all right. You got something else to say? That's great.
Well, I just wanted to reflect, Angelina, the way you kind of said it, it's a way to make life simpler. It's a more simple way of living. And that is the best way to summarize the entire, all of these agreements. And if anyone listening hasn't read this book, read it, because we're
Yes.
covering
Read
the
it.
topics, but
Right.
the way it's introduced and how we make agreements with ourselves, one way or another, you're making an agreement with yourself. These are his suggestions, and man, do I get behind it. And I just want to actually bring it to more a little bit more applicable. That's why I didn't want to move on to the next one
Yeah,
yet.
no, it's great. Go with your gut, John. I love this. I love this.
Maybe if we only get through two, Joe, we can our next episode can be the next two, our
100%.
next three. But
Absolutely. Yes.
where I've seen this manifest itself the most, or one of the most, the be impeccable with your word. That impeccable piece is so important, to be impeccable with your word.
It's a great word, by the way. Impeccable. I love that word.
It really is, yeah. And where I've seen it manifest itself most positively in my life is it goes along with every word out of our mouth should be words to build up others. There should be a reason for words. So specifically this, relationship with my wife, or even with my daughters. You do something that, man, did that just tick me off? You push my buttons, you did something, I'm ready to fly off the handle, you know what I mean? And then to take a second and be like, well, what's the purpose of the next words coming out of my mouth? Is it to get revenge because you made me feel a certain way? Is it to tear you down because I felt like you just tore me down? You gave me some sort of criticism that I didn't want to hear at that moment. I probably needed to hear it, but I didn't want to hear it at that moment. Right. Yeah. And let's even pivot that to the place of work, right? Someone did something or said something or said something that really was just like, that boiled my blood a little bit. And so I have a lot of things I want to say to you to let you know how I feel about that.
Yes.
And to take a second. Now, I know a lot of times we say write the email and then delete it, or write the email and then rewrite it. Or for me, it is, I'm going to take a step away from the heat of the moment in my house, and I'm going to think this through, because the next words out of my mouth, if they're going to be impeccable, they better be important enough to even say. And they better be something to not tear you down just to make you feel the way you just made me feel. Yeah. But I'm going to be the bigger person. I'm going to process this. I'm going to think this through. And you know what? I'm not even kidding. 9 times out of 10, I realize I don't even need to say anything. However, there are times where you do need to say something, and because for the betterment of your relationship, either with my spouse, my daughters, or for the better of the relationship with me and those that report to me at work, and for the greater good of the organization, for the greater good of the relationship, for the greater good of the individual, I might want to say, like, listen, this is how I perceived that, and this is how I think maybe we could address this differently next time. It should really be the only response to those type of things. So I just wanted to say, like, the real active way I've used that in my life is in those scenarios. Take a second, be impeccable with the words coming out of my mouth, so they're not heat of the moment, emotion driven, tearing someone down, setting it straight, and being right, because I need to be right. Just take a second and make sure the words coming out are of use and will make this world a little bit a better place, make a relationship a little bit better.
All right, so let me respond to that. And Angelina, if you've got something, you certainly can as well. That's well put, and I'm so glad you decided to put the brakes on this. So the word impeccable, which is just fun to say, impeccable, I don't use that nearly enough, and I need to work that in my vocabulary as often as I can. Impeccable, it just sounds fun. But for whatever reason, I think because I grew up in Montana and my grandparents had a farm and they had chickens, and so immediately I'm thinking chickens, impeccable, because they peck all the time. That's how they eat. But so let's put this in a leadership metaphor, right? Everybody knows that the leaders are the ones who become the target. The farther up you are in the organization, the more eyes are on you, and the more likely you're going to be criticized for anything and everything you do or don't do, and especially what you say. And so you've got the chickens pecking away, right? And they're pecking and they're pecking. They're trying to find the soft spot, the weak spot in your shell, because when they find it, you're going to blow up, and suddenly you're not any better than they are, right? And so I like this idea of being impeccable, is that it's a protective shell in many ways, that if I state the truth in love, this is a biblical principle, and I could go there as well, but when you state the truth in love, right, then it becomes an impervious shell to all of the criticism and critiques, because people cannot pull apart your words if you always say what you mean, and you say it with integrity, and you say it with the intention of building up, as John said. So for leaders who are always feeling like, man, I'm just tired of being the target and people taking pot shots at me, and all the emails are negative and they're judgmental, they're critical, and then I have to defend myself all the time, right? Well, if my words are impeccable, my words already have created a shield to protect me from whatever the pot shots. They're still going to take them, but they bounce off because there's no target there anymore, right? My words have created a protective bubble. That's so I like that idea of being impeccable in terms of the chickens. Angelina, do you want to jump in there before we go to number 3?
Number 2.
Number 2.
Where are we? Right.
No, I'm complete. That was
All right,
awesome,
good.
John.
All right, John, read number 2 for us,
Both
if
of
you
you.
would.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So number 2, don't take anything personally.
Ouch.
Nothing other, right? It's so simple, but yet it is so not simple. Nothing others do is because of you. What others say and do is a projection of their own reality, their own dream. That dream word will make more sense if you read the book. When you are immune to the opinions and actions of others, you won't be the victim of needless suffering.
All right, I got to ask you to read that one more time because there's so much there. Then we'll go right to Angelina.
And so Angelina's ready to jump in. So I'll do a little faster this time. Don't take anything personally. Nothing others do is because of you. What others say and do is a projection of their own reality. When you are immune to the opinions and actions of others, you won't be the victim of needless suffering.
Awesome. Angelina, run with that, please.
Oh my gosh, this is so just like, there's so much here. It's so good.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to relate this to my personal life, to my life growing up. One of the things that I remember both my sister and me saying to one another about one of our parents was that they always make everything about them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I believe that my sister brought this to the table, and it took me a minute to really like wrap my head around what she was saying. And then she showed me some examples, and I was like, oh yeah, right? Fast forward 10, 15 years, and guess what I got to notice inside of myself?
Right.
This pattern of making somebody else's, especially my children's, experiences, challenges, struggles, successes, right?
Yes.
Right? And so this is a manifestation of taking things personally. That once you realize that this is a manifestation and you can relate it to something in your own life, because I think probably all of us have at least one person in our life who has this behavior, and we know how awful it feels to be it, because it's very invalidating on a personal level.
Yes,
right?
100%.
It's like all of a sudden you disappear in their reality, and you know that they aren't actually thinking or talking about you at all. They're only thinking or talking about them. And so this is a grotesque expression of this principle, but it's something that is also very, very relatable, I think. And so that was the nuance I kind of wanted to pull out of this one, because it's really powerful.
Beautiful. Yeah. So this is one that hits really close to home because I've lived a pretty sensitive guy overall, even though I'm a manly man, and I could come across, like it's not bothering me because I don't express how much it's bothering me, but I bottle it up. So people say these things and I take it personally because of what I think they mean, right? And as Jay Shetty points out, and I love this, he says, we're not really afraid of what other people think of us. We're afraid of what we think other people think of us. Because we don't know what other people think of us. We think we do, or we're afraid of what they're going to think of us, but all of that is our projection of what we think someone else is thinking of us. And that's so true of all the stuff I've been taking personally. It had nothing to do with the other person's intentions most of the time. Sometimes it did, but most of the time it didn't. Most of the time it was my interpretation of what I think they meant by what they said, right? It's all comes from me. And so talk about freedom, right? I really do believe these are principles towards freedom, because when I can begin, and this is a journey for me, but when I can begin to separate my interpretation of what I think somebody else thinks of me because of what they've said or done, then it's a release, right? Because I've been bottling all this up inside. I don't react, I don't respond, I don't fight back. I'm a lover, not a fighter. But what happens is, as I stuff all that down, well, that sucks and that hurts and I don't like that and I wish they wouldn't do that anymore. And then I get filled with all this, what is it when you just angry people? Resentment, that's the word. I get filled with resentment, right? And like any pressure cooker, eventually it's going to come out, and it's going to come out pretty ugly. It's going to scald somebody. It's going to make a mess. Going to blow the lid off, and then people are going to be like, "What's wrong, Joe? You were so calm for the last 2 weeks, 3 months, and all of a sudden you're just spewing all over. And what just happened is so small. What's the deal? The proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. But if I and that isn't anybody else's fault but mine. This is the freedom for me to realize that all that stuffing and holding it inside, which I thought was being kind, really it was being nice. And this is really important for me, and I hope others get this, is that there's a qualitative difference between being kind and being nice. And I believe that being kind should always be the rule. I should always be kind to myself, to others, and to nature. But that doesn't mean I have to be nice all the time. And I think being a parent is what taught me this difference. That and my wife, who points it out to me all the time. And she'll say, Joe, what you said is very nice, but it's not kind because it's not the full truth. You've just placated me, right? And so I realized in this context that the word love, L-O-V-E, the E on love can stand for encourage, equip, empower, edify, but it can't stand for enable. And what I was doing is I was enabling people with my niceness to keep saying all the things that I resent. If I don't draw a boundary and say, hey, that hurts, or what did you mean by that at least, right? Maybe you didn't mean to hurt me, but it did. If I don't say that out loud, I'm enabling them to keep hurting me. Well, that sucks. As you said, life sucks pretty bad when you're in that position all the time. And then I blow up from time to time, and usually on my family, because it's a safe place in my mind to blow up, and they get the worst of me. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that way anymore, right? So by not taking it personally, I'm like, hey, whatever you said or did, that is you, and that's all good. But that doesn't affect who I am or who I think I am or what I believe to be about me, right? And so before I pass this off to you, Jon, one of the biggest epiphanies I've got in my entire life happened about 1.5 years ago. I'm sitting on my couch one morning, I finished my prayer and meditation, and I'm about ready to get up and do the rest of my job, and my eyes are still closed, and this scroll in my own handwriting starts to go across my eyelids, the back of my eyelids, kind of like a movie trailer, right? And it says, hey, Joe, your value, your intrinsic worth is neither dependent on nor determined by anybody else's opinion or approval.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, what? So, and I actually said out loud, nobody's in the room, play it again. Can you play it again? Sure enough, starts to scroll again in my handwriting. Hey, Joe, your intrinsic value, your worth is neither dependent on nor determined by anybody else's approval or opinion of you. And it was signed, Love, God. And I was like, oh, freedom, right? Where has this been all my life? And I got to tell you, that message has probably been there all my life, and I just happened to be in the right place in the right time and open to receive it. But that ties directly into not taking anything personally, because I was letting my identity be shaped by what I thought someone else thought of me, and most of the time that isn't what they were thinking. Okay, Jon, let me pass that into your loving hands, brother.
Yeah, thank you. And what I love about what you just said, Joe, is you wrapped it. When he wrote this book, Miguel Ruiz, he put these agreements in this specific order.
Oh yeah.
For a reason. And what I love what you just said is you talked a lot about being impeccable with your word and how that also relates to not taking anything personally. And so I love that, because I think that's his intent. And this is one of those books where you can't really think about one agreement without somehow wrapping another one in. That's just the genius of how this whole thing's unpacked. So what I want to do is I'm going to try to give an illustration that I think he gave in this book that helps you kind of understand. I'm going to botch it, but I'm going to do my best. I believe
this is the Jon version.
This is the Jon version.
Yeah.
They talks about we are the protagonist in our own movies. Okay. Think of your life as a movie, and all of the characters, all of the actors, you are the writer, you're the director, you're the hero of your own movie. And so your perception of other people is really just how that's manifesting, and you're perceiving it in your own brain. So all of their actions, all the things they say, all the things they do are just your perception of it. Now, Joe, you're the protagonist of your own movie, and you may view, I may think I'm the hero here, the protagonist of my own movie. You may not view me in that way. You may view, you view yourself as like the main character, the number one character. Right. And the reason I think is important is just talks about we have our own view of the world. It's in our own brain. It's our own story. It's our own, this was right or this was wrong, or this is the truth or this is not the truth, or I believe this or I believe that. That is only between your two ears. 100%. And someone else's reality, someone else's movie is going to be completely different. Yeah. So the reason I think that's important in this don't take anything personally is because if I were to say something to you, Joe, that I don't think you did something the way I thought you should have done it, or, you know, maybe gave you some sort of feedback. And if that were to upset you, well, that's just my own that's my own perception of how you behaved.
Yeah.
So I hope that's somewhat helpful. I know I didn't do it perfect justice, but just the fact that we're all viewing life through our own dream, through our own movie, our own version. We're the writers, we're the directors. We are kind of seeing things in that way. So
before you move on, you might have something else to say on that, but before you move on, let me know.
Yeah, I lost it. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to derail your train of thought. I apologize. It reminds me of what I learned from a Brene Brown video. Brene's hilarious, and she's really self-aware, right? And she says that she and her husband get into disagreements all the time. And so her therapist said, try this technique and see how this goes. And it's called The Story in My Head Is, right? And
Yeah.
So what she did is she gave this great story, and I'll botch her story as well. Forgive me, Brene. But she says they went out to the cabin for a family reunion or something. And so there's tons of kids, tons of activities. And no sooner had they gotten there and unpacked everything, but nothing's put away, that Brene realizes her husband's nowhere to be found. In fact, he's down in the lake swimming. And she's got kids, and she's got to create a meal, and she's got all the stuff to put away. So she's fuming inside. How in the world could he do that? Why would he leave me right now? What an insensitive jerk, right? And so she's got this story percolating inside of her, and it's just eating her alive. And so she's watching carefully to see when he's coming back from his swim, and she just storms down to the dock, you know, smoke coming out of her ears. She's ready to give it to him, and she hears the voice of her therapist. Okay, tell him the story that's going on inside your head, and ask him the story that's going on inside his. This is a practice they were working on. So she says, honey, the story in my head says you just bailed on me when I need you the most and left me with all the work. And he says, wow, that's not my story at all. And she's like, well, you better tell me your story right now before I take it out on you. And he says, the story in my head was that you were so upset about everything that I was doing, that I was in your way. I was making your life miserable, and you wanted to do things your way in your time. And so I thought the best thing I could do to help you was to get out of your way. That was the way I was interpreting your actions and your words. So I thought I need to decompress so that I don't explode back to my wife and make our vacation miserable before we even got it started. So I went for a swim to decompress. And of course, they both laughed because they both had a different interpretation about the exact same circumstances. But I can't tell you how powerful that is. And I'm trying to practice that in my own relationships to say, hey, the story in my head, it's going this way and it doesn't feel good. What's the story in your head? And that question alone suspends my judgment that I know what somebody else is feeling or thinking.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye, Angelina.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So good to see you. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, gentlemen. Have a great week. Have a great weekend.
Have a safe trip. Have a safe trip.
Safe travels.
Okay.
Bye.
So, Joe, I love how you did that, because that drove home the point I was trying to make. And I think another visualization for all of us is now understanding that even married couples, you know, close relationship people have two completely different stories. Now
Right.
Think about your life. And when you are walking, you know, through the grocery store, or when you're at work and you see your whole team in front of you, or you're at home, even with your kids and your wife, there are millions and millions and millions and millions of stories being played out. Although we're all living in the same point, we may not be living in the exact same reality.
That's
and
right.
It's a really abstract thing to think about, but if you can wrap your mind around that, this don't take anything personally is important. I need to make a couple other points. Number
Please do.
one,
Yeah.
So just because you shouldn't take it personally and get upset about it doesn't mean you can't learn something from it.
Yeah. Say that again. It's really good.
Just because I forgot what I was
just
because you don't want to take it personally, you know, and you shouldn't get upset by it, and you shouldn't let it derail you, and you shouldn't let it, you know, not be impeccable about your word because you're going to spew insults back at the person that told you something that you might need to hear.
Right.
Doesn't mean you shouldn't listen and possibly do some self-reflection.
Yeah.
So now, one of the things that I've come across is that the stuff we get upset about and what others do is almost 100% of the time something we're upset about ourselves that we do. And you will definitely see this in a close relationship. And it's interesting. It's like, man, the things that my wife tells me I should improve on, I'm like, geez, you do the same thing. Do you not realize that? And then it's like,
Yeah, I feel
right?
that. I feel that.
Right. And I think we all feel that more than we would ever realize. And I think the same thing too is then when I'm about to say like, man, I need to give her this feedback because I need her to do something differently here at home. I'm just like, holy smokes, I do the same thing, don't I? And
Yeah.
so really understand that a lot of, even though that's true, well, the point I'm trying to drive home is even though that's true, and I know she can work on the same thing, or I know I should work on the same thing I tell her, that doesn't mean I shouldn't also do some self-reflection and be like, okay, I'm going to not take that personally because it probably is a reflection of something that she knows deep down within her own self, but maybe isn't quite conscious and aware of it. That still is a moment for me to self-reflect and be like, you know what? There are some improvements I can make here. I'm not going to fire back. I'm not going to get angry about it. I'm not going to take it personally. But you know what? I'm not perfect, for goodness sake. So maybe there's
Yeah.
something I can work on. And I think that's important even in workplace settings as well. You know, like you
Right.
said, Joe, the leader is always the one getting pecked at.
Yep.
So take a second, realize that, hey, this is just, they're frustrated about something in their personal lives. They may be frustrated about something that they do, and then when they see someone else do it, that's why it's so frustrating for them because subconsciously they know they're struggling in that area. Whatever the case may be, there's no reason to take it personally, but don't ignore it. Listen
Yes.
to it, think about it, be honest with yourself as you possibly can, and then move on.
Yeah, so I would say another great way of saying what you're saying, or another framework, or perhaps a tool, a method, is to ask questions. Now, sometimes you ask questions of the other, but sometimes you're asking the questions that John's saying about yourself. Is this true? Is there something I can learn from this? Now, it may be that it's not true. It is all about them, but the only way you know that is to ask the question and to answer it honestly. Is there something in this exchange that I can learn from and I can grow from? That's a super important question, almost in anything that happens in our life, but especially when you get that conflict, right? And the tension. So I got to throw in here this great illustration. I was on a marriage retreat years ago, and the speaker, he said, "Hey Joe, you play ball, right?" I said, "Yeah, yeah." He said, "Stand up. I want to play catch with you." And this is in front of everybody. I said, "Okay." And I didn't know what was going on. So he tosses me this hacky sack, nice and soft, and I catch it, and I throw it back to him. And he's tossing, he's talking, he's sharing whatever he's sharing about. And then he starts throwing it a little bit harder. So I throw a little bit harder back. And then he's throwing it really fast. And I'm catching it. He's giving me compliments. Hey, good catch, good reflexes. But of course, I'm firing it back as hard or harder than he is. And then he winds up like he's going to hit me as hard as he can. And he holds off. And he said, look at the dynamics here. I didn't have any conversation with Joe before this happened. This is human nature. That with whatever force he was receiving it, he was returning it with the same force or a little bit more, right? He said, this is what happens in conversations all the time, in relationships, that somebody will fire something at you, and if they fire it soft, you return with a soft answer. If they fire it harshly, you fire back harshly, because this tendency to fire back with the equal or greater force. And he said, and it gets to the point where people are throwing firebombs at each other, everybody explodes, right? There's no winning in that situation, which I can't help but think of this proverb right out of the Bible that says, a soft answer turns away wrath. A soft answer turns away wrath. This takes everything in me. Simple but challenging. That when people are firing at me or you as a leader, and they're just unloading all of their crap, which may or may not have anything to do with you, but they're unloading it anyway. They're firing both guns, right? Now, the natural tendency is, one, to protect myself, self-preservation, and two is to return the fire, right? But then everybody loses. So if I can tap back into that simple proverb that a soft answer turns away wrath, then, as my friend John says, as a leader, it's my job to absorb the heat from below, not to return it, right? And that is not easy. That's not fun. It's not comfortable, but it is productive.
Absolutely love that illustration. That paints the exact picture. And I'm going to throw another word into that, and is relationships are not a competition.
Ooh, yes.
Although, my goodness, does it feel like it sometimes,
All
because
the time.
when that hacky sack gets thrown at you, you want to throw it right back.
Yeah.
And when you think you're doing more around the house or doing more dishes, or you're at work and you feel like you're pulling more of a weight than somebody else, throwing that hacky sack at them, hitting them with zingers, that is you viewing your relationship, both whether it's professionally, personal, whatever the case may be, that's you viewing it as a competition. It's,
Right.
man, they threw a zinger at me. Now I can't just lose.
Right.
I need to throw a zinger back at them. And that's where that getting out of that competitive mindset allows us to take a second. And if you're going to be the leader, which I think we all should step up and be a leader in every relationship we have.
100%.
Even
Yes.
if it's with your adult, with your parents, you can
Yep.
still be a leader.
Of
So
course.
it's for you to take that zinger, but not take it personally, to think through the filter of being impeccable with your word and only say things to build others up and only do things that's going to be for the greater good of your relationship,
Yeah.
and do that self-reflection and be like, okay, even though I feel like they do the exact same thing and I really want to tell them that, I'm going to take a second. I'm going to see what truth I can find in what they said, what next steps I can take. I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm not going to stew on it. What next steps can I take to be a better version of myself? And then once you cool down, if you feel like, hey, listen, you said this to me and I appreciate your feedback, because I know I don't want you to be scared to give me feedback. So please, I
Yes.
appreciate that. But I want you to know that I do see a very similar tendency in you, or here's something that I see as well. And find that like safe place, that psychologically safe environment in your
Right.
personal relationships and your workplace relationships, so that you can have that team. We're on the same team building each other, not competing on who did the right thing and who did it better and who did it worse.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So, and I want to make the point really clear for those who tune in or after the fact, is that leadership is not a title or a position. It's a mentality, right? It's a understanding of myself, that I can be a follower or a leader in any position, regardless of my title, my position, my salary, my office. I can be a leader or a follower. And quite honestly, we probably should be both, depending on the situation, because there's this journey that we're in life. I call it the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, I got this from Joseph Campbell, that we should be progressing through our life with a mentor and a guide that is giving us some clues as to where the landmines are. And we can choose to listen or not. We can still step in the landmines or not. But then also there's someone behind us who needs to learn, that they haven't come as far as we have, and they need to learn from us. So we are both the hero, we have a mentor, and then we become the mentor for someone behind us, right? So we're the Padawan and the Obi-Wan all in one at any given moment because of the relationships that we're in. But leadership isn't a title or a position or a salary. It is a mentality. It's a philosophy, you might say. I mean, it can be, and I just offer that as well.
Well,
Okay.
I want to bring back something Angelina had said, is
Yeah.
to make sure we understand that leadership, what we're talking about is leadership, doesn't mean you're controlling a situation and telling people what to do.
Right.
Because like you said, even if you're having a relationship with your boss, you can be a leader just in the fact of what's one of the best qualities of leaders. You listen, right? You can be by listening and like just modeling the behavior of a good leader. You might not be able to tell them what to do and manage them and control their next actions, but you can lead by example.
Well, you just used, before we go to the next one, and let's just stay on this one because we only got a few minutes left. We'll pick up the next tenets, the next agreements in the next episode. A couple of things that came to mind, and one is, again, as a leader, it's our job to absorb, not to reflect, right? To absorb what's coming our way. And you can only do that with a very strong sense of self and self-identity and self-love. That's all required. Self-management is the tenet of emotional intelligence, right? So what I want to throw in here is this idea that just came to me a couple of days ago, John, and I want to get your take on it. And I hear a lot of people bashing ego, that ego is my enemy, ego gets me in trouble, that's my ego, and it's all really negative. And I've always had this reservation, like, well, God wouldn't give us an ego. It wouldn't be built into the system if it didn't have a purpose. So I read this book by Howard Falco called I Am. And to summarize, a brilliant book with well worth reading or listening to, Howard says, our ego's one and only job is to prove that whatever we believe is right. Now, the thing is, our belief system is very much in flux all the time. And oftentimes it's a limiting belief system, which, by the way, limiting belief system is LBS, the same as pounds. It keeps you slow, it wears you out, it makes you want to quit. So we have to continue to shed our belief systems because our ego will do anything and everything to prove us right, because that's a self-preservation mechanism. And that's the ego's job, to preserve our life. In fact, if our ego wasn't really healthy, if our ego wasn't doing its job, you and I would have this conversation because our ancestors never would have survived. Yeah. So it's our survival instinct. However, what came to me just a couple of days ago is that really our ego has a polarity to it. On the extreme end on one side is pride. And I think this is the term that people are really referring to when they say ego that's getting me into trouble all the time. That's the pridefulness, where I'm going to blame everybody else. I'm not taking any fault for any of it. I'm not taking any responsibility. And that's pride. And that does get me in trouble all the time. But ego has a polarity. The other end is humility, which is the opposite of pride, right? And if I can push my pride to the humility side of that polarity, it actually serves me quite well. Because then I feel like I don't have to know it all. I don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. I don't have to control anything. And I can be very grateful for the people around me who are working, doing the best they can. Humility never gets me in trouble. Pride always does. In fact, there's a very sobering verse in the Bible that says that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. So do I want to be resisted by God? Do I want to receive grace? That's a pretty easy equation for me. But so how do I train my ego, right? How do I contain my ego and help it get from the pride end, which actually is the default. The pride end of the polarity of my ego is where I tend to go to, and science calls this a negativity bias. We assume in the absence of information that whatever we don't know is going to harm us. Again, self-preservation, but that doesn't serve us very well. How do you get to the humility side, right? And I say you can practice two things. I think there's two key ingredients to humility, and that is gratitude and grace. If I intentionally express gratitude for the blessings in my life, the people in my life, if I'm focusing on what's good rather than what's wrong, what's right in my world, because my default is what's wrong with my world, right? If I can practice gratitude and express gratitude, it's really good for relationships. It's like the oil, the lube of relationships. And it's not an either or, it's an and grace. Grace is the forgiveness, right? When I screw up, when somebody else screws up, I pour in the grace rather than the punishment and the discipline, which goes back to my earlier episode. So I say, and I'd love to get your take on this, Jon, in the last few minutes, is that our ego is neither our foe or our ally unless we allow it to be. And this is a choice, right? We allow our ego to default to the pride side, which causes all sorts of friction and makes life suck more. Or we can intentionally train it through gratitude and grace so our ego flips to the humility side, and suddenly it's our ally, it's our friend, it serves me and others, right? Which is all life really is about: serving God, serving me, serving others in a way that's loving. That's what humility does. And this last story, the kind of capstone, the humility piece is, whoa, they're down with the camera.
Drop my camera.
Jon's down. It's so good. Oh, yes, it happens all the time. So welcome to humanity. So Jon, there's this amazing interview on impact theory, which is a podcast by Tom Bilyeu, and he's interviewing a guy named Mastin Kipp. Mastin's mind, I just listening to him talk expands my heart, my mind. Mastin goes through all this stuff, and he gets to the very end of his conversation. He says, "Here's the deal, Tom. I have access to some of the most quote unquote successful people in the entire world. I counsel them, I mentor them, I coach them. They have everything you could ever dream of. They've accomplished ridiculous things that most people never do. They have all the money in the world, all the power, all the prestige, all the things that we strive after, right? They have climbed to the top of the mountain." And he said, that's a really small percentage of humanity, tiny percentage. And he said, in that group, there is a tiny, tiny sliver of that tiny sliver that are actually happy. Most of them behind closed doors, if you take their name off the record, they'll say, I'm miserable. This isn't the life I want. How did I get here? This sucks, right? And they have everything you could imagine, right? So Mastin said, I was just floored by this whole thing. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, because we talk ourselves into that all these external things are somehow going to make us fulfilled. So he said, I began comparing all my notes. Is there anything in common with this tiny percentage of the elite, successful people that is the common thread of the ones that say, I like my life. I'm very happy to be here. I wouldn't want anything any different. This is the best life ever. Because there was just a little tiny bit that did that, a few of them. And he said, there's one common thread, only one. And Tom, of course, he's on the edge of his seat. Well, what? What is it? He says, they didn't take credit for any of it. They didn't take credit for any of it. They said, there's no way I would have got here on my own. In fact, I couldn't have got on the planet on my own. Somebody had to give me birth. Somebody had to nurture me. As humans, we can't even survive for the first several years of our life without others. But that's actually physically, emotionally, and spiritually, we can't survive without others our entire life. And so, I've heard it say, if you get to the top of the mountain, you're alone, you did it wrong, because you're alone and you're miserable. There's no one to share the joy with. And so the ones who succeeded, and they're the elite of the elite, the reason they're happy and blessed is because of their humility. They're like, I couldn't have done this alone. There's no way. and they give the credit to everybody. And it wasn't like this false humility, like, well, I had nothing to do with it, because they know they did the work, they put the work in, but they know they could not have done it alone. So there you go. I'll hand that to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can respond in a way that'll help bring us to a close as well.
Perfect. Good timing.
Yeah, because I don't think I have anything to add. I think you unpacked ego very well. I think it is a scapegoat, right? And it is actually responsible for some of the things when people say, oh, ego's a bad thing, or that was just your ego. Yeah,
Sure.
responsible for it. But like you said, it does not mean there isn't a good side and a useful side of your ego, which is 100% true. I'd also agree. Humility, gratitude, grace. Those are ways to tap into that beneficial side. And I think the way to bring it all to a close is, first of all, to go back to what I said at the very beginning on what I'm passionate about in this leadership realm is to recognize your own deficiencies and to work on them, right? To recognize that you aren't perfect, and there are things for you to work on, and then B, to have a goal of enhancing your relationships. Okay.
Yes.
Building relationships, having more loving relationships, making developing them in a way that's for like the greater good of that human being, not just having relationships that are going to be self-serving, right? But a mutually beneficial, God right in the middle of, loving your neighbor as yourself type of deal. And I think if by tapping into that side of your ego and having those be your goals, to be a better version of if you had no other goals in life but to be a better version of yourself and to work on your relationships, I think you're going to live a very fulfilled life. And to tie it right back to the 4 agreements, we only got to 2, but even just working on being impeccable with your word and then not taking anything personally, just those 2 things. I think it was Angelina that used the word freedom.
Yes.
If your only goals are to do to do those 2 things, work on yourself and develop relationships, and if you use things like these be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, do your best, be skeptical, learn to listen, all of these agreements, you will have that freedom and life will just seem a lot more simple. And it doesn't mean you can't be successful and have drive and have passion and want to grow a successful business and want to make a lot of money. There's nothing wrong with any of that.
Right.
So long as you have humility, so long as you're working on yourself, so long as you're working on those relationships with others, you can have it all. But I'm not surprised, Joe, that it's a small fraction of the small fraction.
Yeah. So before we close out today, Jon, I just had this sense that there's often we confuse means goals with ends goals. And so this is a whole nother topic, and I just want to touch on just briefly that oftentimes we think that money and fame and power and accomplishments and accolades, positions, titles, offices, which are all external, by the way, they're all external rewards. We think those are the ends goals. We misinterpret them as the ends goals. Those are just means to an end. The end is the internal joy, peace, love, relationships, right? Fulfillment, purpose. That's what we truly want. Right? And we think that if we get all the external things, that'll make us feel differently inside. Well, it turns out there's not a connect there. That's a major disconnect. So it's really important to understand that all of these things are not bad, but they're means goals. They're not ends goals. And when we get that screwed up, well, then we get unfulfilled. We get unhappy. So turn the means goals, or don't make sure that your means goals don't become ends goals, and that your ends goals don't become means goals. If you can keep those straight, it does make life suck less and actually give us a lot more freedom. So there's so much more that can be said. Jacqueline Gonzalez, thank you so much for listening in, for your comment about, thanks for your comment and your listening. And thank you, Jon Weirauch, Jon Millenial, Angelina Frost, and Kristina Holle, who could not join us today, for this great discussion. And I guess it shouldn't surprise me that of the 5 agreements, we got through 2, because we always have quite a bit to say. But I love this. I love the fact that we can now dig deep, just not into these 2, but into the 3 remaining agreements. So for those that have tuned in now or will tune afterwards, we'll pick this up with agreement number 3 next week. So until next time, Jon bless you and your family. And let us remember, ideation without implementation is delusion. Don't be deluded, right? Take the steps. Dream big, start small, act now, and don't quit. Peace to you.